The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Windsor Castle as Lady Margaret Shand stepped out of the black sedan, her weathered hands gripping the doorframe with more force than necessary. At 78, she had seen enough of life's disappointments, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. The golden gates that had welcomed her daughter Camilla into the heart of the British monarchy now stood firmly closed against her own family. Margaret's younger sister, Annabel Elliot, emerged from the passenger side, her designer handbag clutched tightly against her chest like a shield. The two women had been inseparable since childhood, weathering scandals and triumphs together, but today their bond felt fragile under the weight of royal rejection. Behind them, Camilla's children from her first marriage. Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes exchanged worried glances as they gathered near the imposing entrance. The security guard, resplendent in his crimson uniform, approached with measured steps. His face remained impassive as he consulted the clipboard in his hands, though everyone present could sense the awkwardness radiating from his rigid posture. This was not a conversation he relished having with the Queen Consort's immediate family. "I'm terribly sorry," he began, his voice carefully neutral, "but I'm afraid your names are not on today's approved visitor list." The words hung in the crisp morning air like a death sentence, each syllable carrying the weight of institutional power and ancient protocol. Margaret's eyes flashed with indignation. She had been coming to royal residences for over 2 decades, first as the mother of the Prince of Wales's companion, then as mother-in-law to the future king. The security protocols had always been stringent, but never before had she been turned away at the gates like a common intruder. Her voice trembled with barely contained emotion as she spoke. "There must be some mistake," she said, though even as the words left her lips, she knew there was no error. This was deliberate, calculated, and devastating in its implications. "We have always been welcome here. My daughter is the Queen Consort." The guard's expression softened slightly, betraying his personal discomfort with the situation. He had witnessed many uncomfortable encounters in his years of service, but turning away the Queen Consort's mother was unprecedented. "I understand your confusion, madam, but the new protocols are quite clear. All visitors must be pre-approved through the proper channels, regardless of their relationship to members of the royal family." Tom Parker Bowles stepped forward, his journalist instincts kicking in despite his personal involvement in the unfolding drama. At 49, he had inherited his mother's diplomatic skills and his father's military bearing, but neither seemed adequate for navigating this particular minefield. "When did these new protocols take effect?" he asked, his tone professional yet strained. "The changes were implemented following the recent security review," the guard replied, referencing the comprehensive evaluation that had been conducted in the wake of several high-profile breaches at royal properties. All family members, staff, and regular visitors received notification of the new procedures. Laura Lopes, normally the quieter of Camilla's 2 children, felt her composure beginning to crack. As an art curator accustomed to handling delicate situations with grace and diplomacy, she found herself unprepared for this very public humiliation. Her children, Camilla's beloved grandchildren, had been looking forward to their regular visit with their grandmother, and now she would have to explain why they could not enter the palace that had become such a familiar part of their lives. "We received no such notification," Laura said, her voice steady despite the turmoil churning within her. "Surely there's been an administrative oversight that can be corrected." The guard consulted his clipboard once more, though they all knew he was simply buying time while deciding how to handle the increasingly tense situation. Other visitors had begun to gather behind them, their curious whispers adding to the mounting pressure. A photographer from a tabloid newspaper had materialized from nowhere, his camera clicking rapidly as he captured every moment of the family's distress. Annabel Elliot, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to moving in elite circles, but also the vulnerability of a woman watching her family's world crumble. "I think it would be best if we spoke with someone in authority," she suggested, her words carefully measured. "Surely this matter can be resolved quickly and quietly." The guard nodded gratefully, recognizing an opportunity to escalate the situation away from the increasingly public spectacle at the gates. "I'll contact the duty officer immediately," he said, retreating to his guardhouse to make the necessary calls. As they waited, Margaret found herself studying the familiar facade of the castle with new eyes. Every stone seemed to mock her, every tower a reminder of the privilege that had been so suddenly and inexplicably withdrawn. She thought of all the times she had walked through these gates with pride, knowing that her daughter had found happiness and purpose within these walls. The irony was not lost on her that the very institution that had elevated Camilla was now treating her family as outsiders. Tom attempted to lighten the mood by making small talk about the weather and the impressive autumn foliage surrounding the castle grounds, but his efforts fell flat against the weight of their collective anxiety. The photographer continued his work, no doubt crafting headlines about royal family drama and palace intrigue that would dominate the tabloids for days to come. Laura checked her phone repeatedly, hoping for a message from her mother that might explain the situation or provide guidance on how to proceed. But Camilla's silence was telling in itself, suggesting that she was either unaware of her family's predicament or powerless to intervene on their behalf. Either possibility was deeply troubling. The duty officer who eventually emerged from the castle was a stern-faced woman in her 50s, her uniform impeccably pressed, and her manner professionally courteous yet unyielding. She approached the group with the measured gait of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome news to disappointed visitors. "I've reviewed the situation with the appropriate authorities," she announced without preamble. "I'm afraid the new security protocols do not permit exceptions, even for family members of senior royals. All visits must be scheduled through the proper channels, with appropriate advance notice." Margaret felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. "How much advance notice?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Current procedures require a minimum of 14 days for security clearance processing," the officer replied matter-of-factly. "Emergency exceptions may be considered under extraordinary circumstances, but such requests must be submitted in writing with appropriate justification." The absurdity of the situation was not lost on any of them. They were being asked to apply for permission to visit Camilla as if she were a stranger, rather than their daughter, mother, and sister. The bureaucratic maze that had been erected around their family relationships felt both surreal and deeply hurtful. As the morning wore on and their situation became increasingly untenable, the family found themselves facing a choice that would define their relationship with the monarchy for years to come. They could accept this new reality and submit to the degrading process of applying for visiting privileges, or they could make a statement by walking away with their dignity intact. Margaret looked at her grandchildren, Tom and Laura, and saw her own confusion and hurt reflected in their faces. The golden gates that had once symbolized welcome and inclusion now stood as barriers, transformed overnight from portals of privilege into instruments of exclusion. The morning mist had lifted, but the shadows cast by this encounter would linger far longer than anyone could have imagined. The black sedan pulled away from Windsor Castle with its passengers wrapped in stunned silence. Margaret Shand stared out the window at the familiar countryside. But the rolling green hills that had always brought her comfort now seemed alien and unwelcoming. The rejection at the palace gates had shaken something fundamental in her understanding of her place in the world, and she found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about her family's relationship with the monarchy. Tom Parker Bowles broke the silence first, his voice carefully controlled as he processed the morning's events. "We need to understand what's really happening here," he said, pulling out his phone to scroll through his contacts. As a food writer and critic, he had cultivated relationships across London's social and media landscape, connections that might prove valuable in unraveling the mystery of their sudden exclusion. "This isn't just about security protocols," Laura added, her art curator's eye for detail having caught subtleties in the guards' behavior that others might have missed. The way they looked at us, the hesitation before delivering their prepared statements. This was planned. Someone wanted us to be turned away, and they wanted it to be public. Annabelle shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her mind racing through the possible implications of what had just occurred. As an interior designer who had worked on several royal properties, she understood the intricate web of relationships and rivalries that existed within the palace walls. "Have you considered," she said carefully, "that this might not be about us at all? Perhaps Camilla herself is being isolated, and we're just collateral damage." The suggestion sent a chill through the car. If Camilla was indeed being marginalized within the royal household, It would represent a dramatic shift in the power dynamics that had seemed so stable just months earlier. Margaret felt a familiar maternal instinct stirring within her, the same fierce protectiveness that had sustained her through the difficult years when Camilla's relationship with Charles had been the subject of relentless public scrutiny. "We need to speak with her directly," Margaret declared, though even as she said it, she wondered if such a conversation would be possible. The Queen Consort's schedule was managed by a team of private secretaries and protocol officers, creating layers of bureaucracy that could easily be used to prevent unwanted contact. Tom was already working his phone, reaching out to contacts within the media establishment who might have insights into recent developments at the palace. His conversation with a veteran royal correspondent revealed troubling rumors about tensions between different factions within the royal household, disagreements about the future direction of the monarchy that had apparently escalated into open conflict. "There's talk of a major reorganization," he reported to his family after ending the call. "Some of the old guard are apparently pushing back against changes that Charles and Camilla have been trying to implement. The security review might have been used as cover for a broader effort to limit their influence." The car turned into the driveway of Margaret's country house, a modest but elegant property that had been her refuge during the most turbulent periods of her daughter's public life. As they gathered in her sitting room, surrounded by family photographs and mementos that chronicled decades of shared history, the contrast with their morning experience at the palace could not have been more stark. Laura began researching the new security protocols online. Her laptop balanced on her knees as she navigated through official government websites and palace communications. What she discovered was both enlightening and disturbing. The changes had indeed been implemented recently, but the language used in the announcements suggested a level of restriction that went far beyond reasonable security measures. "Listen to this," she said, reading from an official statement. "All personal visitors to royal residences must undergo comprehensive background checks and receive advance authorization from the Master of the Household's office. This includes immediate family members of senior royals, who are no longer exempt from standard security procedures." The implications were staggering. Camilla's own mother would now be subject to the same security clearance process as a foreign dignitary or business associate. The personal relationships that had sustained the royal family through generations of change and challenge were being systematically bureaucratized, stripped of their human dimension and reduced to administrative procedures. Margaret stood up abruptly, her emotional composure finally giving way to anger. 30 years, she said, her voice rising with each word. 30 years I've supported that relationship, defended it when the entire country seemed determined to destroy it, watched my daughter sacrifice her privacy and her peace of mind for the sake of duty and love. And now they treat us like criminals who need to be vetted before we can share a cup of tea. Tom reached out to comfort his grandmother, but she was beyond consolation. The morning's humiliation had tapped into a deeper reservoir of resentment and frustration that had been building for years. She had watched Camilla navigate the treacherous waters of royal life with grace and determination, but she had also witnessed the toll that constant scrutiny and protocol had taken on her daughter's spirit. "They've forgotten that we're people, not just supporting players in their grand drama," Margaret continued, pacing around the room like a caged animal. "Camilla isn't just the queen consort, she's my daughter, Tom and Laura's mother, a grandmother who wants to see her grandchildren without having to file paperwork in triplicate." Annabelle attempted to inject some rationality into the emotional atmosphere. "Perhaps we're overreacting," she suggested gently. "These changes might be temporary, a response to specific security concerns that will be relaxed once the perceived threat has passed." But Laura was shaking her head, her research having uncovered additional details that painted a grimmer picture. "I found references to similar restrictions being implemented at other royal residences," she reported. "This isn't just about Windsor. It's a systematic overhaul of access protocols across the entire royal estate." The scope of the changes suggested a level of planning and coordination that could only have come from the highest levels of the royal establishment. Someone with significant authority had decided that the traditional informality of royal family relationships posed an unacceptable risk, and they were prepared to sacrifice decades of precedent to implement their vision of a more secure and controlled monarchy. Tom's phone buzzed with an incoming call from another media contact, this one with connections to the security services. The conversation was brief but revealing, confirming their worst suspicions about the political dimensions of the morning's events. "It's not just about security," he reported grimly. "There's apparently been pressure from government officials who believe the royal family has become too accessible, too informal. They want to restore what they call appropriate distance between the monarchy and the public, starting with stricter controls on who can access royal properties." The revelation added a new layer of complexity to their situation. What they had initially interpreted as a personal slight was apparently part of a broader political strategy to reshape the monarchy for the 21st century. Their exclusion from Windsor was not an oversight or a bureaucratic error. It was a statement about the kind of royal family Britain was going to have going forward. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across Margaret's garden, the family found themselves grappling with questions that went far beyond their personal predicament. If the monarchy was indeed being transformed into a more distant and formal institution, what would that mean for Camilla's role within it? How could she fulfill her duties as queen consort while being systematically cut off from the personal relationships that had always sustained her? The golden gates of Windsor had not just been closed to them that morning. They had been locked against a way of life that had defined the royal family for generations. The question now was whether Camilla would have the power to reopen them, or whether she too would find herself trapped behind barriers that she had never chosen to erect. 3 days had passed since the incident at Windsor Castle, and still no word from Camilla. Margaret Shand found herself checking her phone obsessively, hoping for a text message or call that might explain her daughter's silence. The queen consort's usual weekly phone call to her mother had not materialized, and attempts to reach her through official channels had been met with polite but firm deflections from palace staff. The media coverage had been relentless. Photographs of the family's rejection at the castle gates had appeared on front pages across Britain, accompanied by speculation about rifts within the royal family and questions about Camilla's position within the new regime. The headlines ranged from sympathetic, "Queen's mother turned away from palace," to sensational, "Royal family in crisis as Camilla's clan locked out." Tom Parker Bowles sat in his London flat surrounded by newspapers and printouts of online articles, trying to piece together a coherent narrative from the fragments of information he had gathered. His professional instincts as a journalist were at war with his emotional investment as a son, creating a painful tension that manifested in sleepless nights and abandoned meals. His investigation had revealed disturbing details about the power struggle taking place behind palace walls. Sources within the royal household spoke of increasing tension between Charles and a coalition of senior courtiers who believed the new king was moving too quickly to modernize the monarchy. Camilla, as his closest advisor and most trusted confidant, had apparently become a lightning rod for this opposition. "She's being blamed for changes that Charles himself initiated," Tom explained to his sister during one of their daily strategy calls. "They can't directly challenge the king, so they're targeting her instead. Making it impossible for her to maintain her personal relationships is just one way of isolating her and limiting her influence." Lara was coordinating efforts from her home in Wiltshire, using her extensive network of contacts in the art world to gather intelligence about the broader political context surrounding the royal family. What she discovered painted a picture of institutional resistance to change that went far beyond palace intrigue. "I spoke with someone who works for the Treasury," she reported. "There's apparently been pressure from government ministers who believe the royal family needs to project a more formal image to maintain public support. They think Camilla's approachable style undermines the mystique of monarchy." The irony was bitter. Camilla had spent years cultivating the very qualities that had made her popular with the British public: warmth, accessibility, and genuine engagement with ordinary people. Her informal style and obvious devotion to her family had helped to rehabilitate her image after the difficult years following Diana's death. Now those same qualities were being viewed as liabilities by officials who preferred a more traditional and distant royal presence. Margaret found herself revisiting old photograph albums, searching through decades of family memories for clues about how their situation had deteriorated so rapidly. Pictures of christenings, weddings, and birthday celebrations told the story of a family that had gradually been absorbed into the royal establishment, their personal relationships becoming increasingly public and scrutinized. She paused at a photograph taken during Charles and Camilla's wedding in 2005, a small civil ceremony that had been both a triumph and a compromise. The image captured her walking alongside the new Duchess of Cornwall, both women smiling despite the media circus surrounding them. Margaret remembered feeling hopeful that day, believing that the worst of their struggles was behind them. "How naive we were," she murmured to herself, closing the album with more force than necessary. The telephone rang, causing her heart to skip with anticipation, but it was only Annabelle calling with updates from her own network of contacts, in interior design and society circles. The news was not encouraging. "People are talking," Annabelle reported carefully. "There are rumors that Camilla has been advised to distance herself from her family to avoid further controversy. Some are saying she's been given an ultimatum: choose between her role as queen consort and her personal relationships." The suggestion was devastating in its implications. If true, it would represent the ultimate triumph of institutional control over human connection, reducing Camilla to little more than a ceremonial figure stripped of the personal ties that had always defined her identity. Tom's research had uncovered historical precedents that made the current situation even more troubling. He had found records of previous instances where royal family members had been pressured to sacrifice personal relationships for the sake of their official duties, creating patterns of isolation and dysfunction that had echoed through generations. "Look at what happened to Edward VIII, he said during a family conference call that evening. "They gave him an impossible choice between duty and love. And when he chose love, they exiled him completely. The difference is that Camilla has already made her commitment to the institution. Now they're trying to use that commitment against her." Laura had been working on a different angle, reaching out to constitutional experts and historians who might provide insight into the legal and procedural aspects of their situation. What she discovered was that the new security protocols existed in a legal gray area, implemented through administrative channels without parliamentary oversight or public debate. The changes were authorized under existing emergency powers related to royal protection, she explained. But there's no clear mechanism for appealing decisions or challenging the restrictions. We're essentially at the mercy of whoever is making these determinations behind closed doors. The family found themselves caught in a bureaucratic labyrinth designed to be impenetrable to outsiders. Their attempts to secure meetings with responsible officials were met with referrals to other departments, which in turn referred them elsewhere, in an endless cycle of administrative deflection. Meanwhile, the public reaction to their situation had been surprisingly sympathetic. Social media campaigns supporting the family had gained momentum, with hashtags like #LetCamillaSeeMum trending across platforms. Opinion polls showed that a majority of Britons believed the restrictions were excessive and counterproductive, but public support, while emotionally gratifying, did little to change their practical circumstances. The palace remained as inaccessible as ever, and Camilla's continued silence suggested that she was either unwilling or unable to intervene on their behalf. Margaret made a decision that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. She picked up the phone and dialed the number of a tabloid journalist who had been particularly persistent in requesting interviews about the family's situation. "I think it's time we told our side of the story," she announced to her family, her voice carrying a determination that had been absent since their rejection at Windsor Castle. Tom and Laura exchanged worried glances, understanding the implications of their mother's decision. Once they went public with their grievances, there would be no going back to the quiet, private relationship they had always maintained with the royal family. "Are you sure about this?" Tom asked gently. "Once we cross that line, we can't uncross it." Margaret's response was immediate and resolute. "They've already crossed the line by treating us like strangers. At least this way we can ensure that people understand what's really happening to families like ours who've given everything to support this institution." As evening fell over the Wiltshire countryside, the Shand family found themselves preparing for a battle they had never wanted to fight. The golden gates of Windsor had not just excluded them from a building, they had pushed them toward a confrontation that would test the very foundations of their relationship with the monarchy they had served so faithfully for so many years. The newspaper interview had been scheduled for the following morning, but Margaret Shand barely slept as she prepared for what felt like the most important conversation of her life. She sat at her kitchen table in the pre-dawn darkness, nursing a cup of tea and rehearsing the words that would either restore her family's relationship with the royal household or destroy it forever. At 7 o'clock sharp, her phone rang with a call that changed everything. The voice on the other end was instantly recognizable. Camilla herself, speaking in hushed tones that suggested she was calling from somewhere within the palace walls where privacy was not guaranteed. "Mummy, I'm so sorry," Camilla began, her voice thick with emotion. "I've only just learned what happened at Windsor. They've been keeping things from me, screening my calls, managing my schedule so tightly that I haven't had a moment to think clearly." The relief that flooded through Margaret was so intense it left her momentarily speechless. After days of silence and speculation, hearing her daughter's voice felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. But the content of Camilla's words was deeply troubling, confirming their worst fears about the level of control being exerted over her daily life. "They told me you were busy with your own commitments," Camilla continued, anger creeping into her voice. "Said that you understood the new security requirements and were happy to comply with the advanced booking system. I only discovered the truth when I saw the newspaper photographs yesterday." Margaret found her voice at last. "We tried to reach you through the proper channels, but we were told you were unavailable. How is it possible that they can control your access to your own family?" There was a long pause before Camilla responded, and when she did, her words carried the weight of someone who was only beginning to understand the scope of her isolation. "It's been gradual," she admitted. "Small changes in protocol that seemed reasonable individually, but together they've created a cage. My private secretary reviews all my personal correspondence now. My phone calls are monitored for security purposes. Even my meals are planned by committee." The systematic nature of Camilla's isolation was more comprehensive than any of them had imagined. What had appeared to be targeted restrictions on family access was actually part of a broader effort to control every aspect of the Queen Consort's life, reducing her to a carefully managed public figure with no meaningful autonomy. "We have to do something," Margaret said firmly. "I've scheduled an interview with the Telegraph for this morning. I was going to tell them about our treatment at Windsor, but perhaps this conversation changes everything." Camilla's reaction was immediate and panicked. "You can't do that interview, Mummy. They've made it very clear that any public criticism of palace policies will be treated as a direct attack on the monarchy. They're looking for any excuse to label our family as disruptive influences." The threat was explicit and chilling. Speak out against their treatment and face complete ostracism from the royal circle. Accept the restrictions quietly and enable the continued erosion of Camilla's personal autonomy. It was an impossible choice designed to ensure compliance through fear and intimidation. Margaret felt her maternal instincts overriding her caution. "Let them try to exclude us completely," she said defiantly. "We've done nothing wrong, and I won't be silenced by bureaucrats who've never met a real challenge in their privileged lives." But Camilla's next words stopped her cold. "It's not just about exclusion, Mummy. They've made it clear that any family member who creates problems for the monarchy will face consequences beyond just losing palace access. They're talking about tax investigations, business license reviews, media campaigns designed to destroy reputations. They have resources we can't match." The scope of the potential retaliation was breathtaking in its ruthlessness. The royal establishment was apparently prepared to use the full weight of government and institutional power to silence dissent from within their own ranks. Margaret realized that they were not just fighting for visiting privileges. They were confronting a system designed to crush any challenge to its authority. Tom arrived at his grandmother's house just as Margaret was ending her call with Camilla, his face grim with news from his own investigative work. He had spent the night following up on contacts within the security services, and what he had discovered painted an even darker picture of their situation. "They've been building files on all of us," he reported without preamble. "Financial records, personal associations, social media activity. Everything that could potentially be used to discredit us if we become a problem. This isn't just about security protocols. It's about control and intimidation." Laura arrived shortly afterward, her usual composure shaken by discoveries from her own research into the constitutional implications of their treatment. She had found precedents in other constitutional monarchies where family members of senior royals had been systematically isolated and marginalized to prevent potential challenges to official policies. "There's a playbook for this kind of thing," she explained as they gathered around Margaret's kitchen table. When royal family members become too popular or independent, the establishment has ways of limiting their influence without creating public scandals. They isolate them socially, control their access to information, and gradually reduce their role to ceremonial functions. The pattern was depressingly familiar to anyone who had studied the history of royal families. Independent-minded relatives were systematically neutered through a combination of bureaucratic restrictions and social pressure, their personal relationships sacrificed on the altar of institutional stability. Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of canceling the newspaper interview, she decided to expand it, using the opportunity to expose not just their treatment but the broader system of control that was being imposed on Camilla and other family members. "They want to fight dirty?" she said with steel in her voice. "Then, we'll show the public exactly what kind of people are running this institution. Let them explain to the British taxpayers why they're using their money to spy on and intimidate the Queen Consort's family." Tom looked concerned about the potential consequences of such a confrontational approach. "Grandmother, if we do this, there's no going back. They'll use every weapon in their arsenal against us." Margaret's response was immediate and resolute. "They're already using those weapons. The only difference is that now we'll be fighting back instead of just absorbing the punishment." Laura nodded her agreement, her art curator's instinct for strategic planning coming to the fore. "We need to be smart about this," she said. "If we're going to make allegations about systematic abuse of power, we need documentation and evidence that can't be dismissed as family grievances." The next several hours were spent preparing for what they all understood would be a watershed moment in their relationship with the monarchy. They gathered documents, recorded conversations, and compiled evidence of the systematic campaign being waged against their family's autonomy and dignity. As the morning progressed, Margaret found herself thinking about her daughter, trapped behind those golden gates, surrounded by officials who viewed her personal relationships as obstacles to be managed rather than sources of strength to be nurtured. The interview she was about to give would either free Camilla from that isolation or make her situation even more difficult. But some principles Margaret realized were worth fighting for regardless of the personal cost. The right of a mother to see her daughter, of grandchildren to visit their grandmother, of human relationships to exist independently of institutional convenience. These were not negotiable commodities to be traded away for the sake of political expediency. The journalist arrived precisely on time, his tape recorder and notepad ready to capture what would become one of the most explosive royal interviews in recent memory. As Margaret began to speak, she knew that the Golden Gates of Windsor would never look the same to any of them again. The interview appeared on the front page of the Telegraph the next morning with a headline that sent shockwaves through the British establishment. "Queen Consort's mother reveals palace isolation campaign against royal family." Margaret Shand's carefully chosen words had created exactly the kind of public relations nightmare that palace officials had been trying to avoid. Within hours of the newspaper hitting the stands, Margaret's phone was ringing non-stop with calls from media outlets around the world. The story had struck a nerve with the public, tapping into broader concerns about the accessibility and humanity of the modern monarchy. Social media exploded with support for the Shand family, while constitutional experts debated the implications of the restrictions on live television. But the palace's response was swift and severe. By midday, an official statement had been released expressing disappointment with the family's decision to air private grievances in public and emphasizing the monarchy's commitment to appropriate security measures. The carefully worded text managed to sound both defensive and dismissive, exactly the kind of bureaucratic language that had fueled public skepticism about royal transparency. Tom Parker Bowles found himself at the center of the media storm, fielding calls from news organizations seeking additional details about his family's treatment. As a journalist himself, he understood the mechanics of the story's appeal. It combined royal drama with questions about institutional power and personal freedom that resonated far beyond traditional royal watching circles. "The response has been overwhelming," he told his grandmother during a brief break between interviews. "We've touched something deeper than just sympathy for our situation. People are connecting this to their own experiences with bureaucratic overreach and institutional control." Laura was monitoring online reaction from her home, watching as the hashtag #FreeTheQueen'sFamily gained momentum across multiple platforms. The public support was gratifying, but she remained focused on the practical implications of their very public confrontation with the palace establishment. "They'll have to respond substantively now," she observed during a family conference call. "The story has too much traction to be dismissed with bland official statements. Either they'll have to defend their actions publicly, or they'll have to change them." The pressure mounted throughout the day as prominent public figures began weighing in on the controversy. Former prime ministers, constitutional scholars, and even members of parliament expressed concern about the restrictions being placed on the Queen Consort's family. The story had evolved from a personal grievance into a broader debate about the balance between security and accessibility in the modern monarchy. Margaret found herself both exhilarated and terrified by the response to her decision to go public. She had hoped to shine a light on her family's treatment, but the scale of the reaction suggested that she had inadvertently triggered a much larger conversation about royal power and accountability. The palace's next move came in the form of a private phone call to Margaret's house. The caller identified himself as a senior private secretary to the king, his tone formal but urgent as he requested an immediate meeting to discuss resolving this unfortunate situation. The offer came with implicit threats about the consequences of continued public criticism, but also hints at possible compromises. Margaret agreed to the meeting, but insisted that Tom and Laura be included in any discussions. She was no longer willing to navigate the labyrinth of royal protocol alone, having learned too much about the system's capacity for manipulation and deception. The meeting took place at a neutral location, a government office building in central London that served as a venue for sensitive discussions requiring discretion. The palace representatives who arrived were a mix of senior courtiers and security officials, their demeanor suggesting they viewed this as a crisis management exercise rather than a genuine attempt at reconciliation. The lead negotiator was a woman in her 60s who introduced herself as Deputy Private Secretary to the Queen Consort, though Margaret had never heard Camilla mention her name. Her opening statement made it clear that the palace viewed the family's public criticism as a serious breach of protocol that could not be tolerated. "The monarchy depends on discretion and trust," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "When family members use the media to air private grievances, it undermines the institution's ability to function effectively." Tom's response was immediate and pointed. "The institution's ability to function shouldn't depend on silencing legitimate concerns about how family members are treated," he said. "We went public because private channels weren't working, not because we wanted to damage anyone's reputation." The negotiations that followed were tense and complicated, with both sides trying to find a face-saving compromise that would end the public controversy, without either side appearing to capitulate completely. The palace officials offered to streamline the security clearance process for family visits, while demanding assurances that no further media interviews would be given about internal palace matters. Laura pressed for specifics about the proposed changes, her experience in contract negotiations serving her well in parsing the deliberately vague language being used by the palace representatives. What emerged was a complex system of restrictions and permissions that would still leave the family's access subject to bureaucratic control, though with somewhat less onerous procedures. "This doesn't address the fundamental problem," Laura observed during a brief recess in the negotiations. "They're still treating our family relationships as privileges to be granted, rather than natural rights to be respected." But Margaret was beginning to feel the weight of the situation's complexity. The public attention had created pressure for resolution, but it had also raised the stakes for everyone involved. A complete breakdown in negotiations would leave Camilla even more isolated, while a compromise that appeared to validate the palace's position might encourage further restrictions in the future. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a direct phone call from Camilla herself to the negotiating room. Speaking on speakerphone with the palace officials present, she made it clear that she considered her family's access to be a personal matter rather than a security issue, and that she expected reasonable accommodation for their relationships. "I understand the need for appropriate protocols," she said, her voice carrying the authority of her position as Queen Consort, "but I will not accept systems that treat my mother like a potential security threat or that require my children to undergo background checks to share a meal with me." The Queen Consort's intervention shifted the dynamic in the room dramatically. The palace officials found themselves caught between their institutional desire to control access and their obligation to respect the wishes of a senior royal. The compromise that emerged reflected this tension, creating a middle ground that neither side found entirely satisfactory but both could accept. Under the new arrangement, immediate family members would be exempt from the most onerous security requirements while still being subject to reasonable advance notice requirements. Regular visits would be streamlined through a simplified booking system, while emergency access would be available under clearly defined circumstances. As the family left the government building late that evening, Margaret felt a complex mixture of relief and uncertainty. They had achieved a partial victory, securing improved access while establishing their right to speak out against unreasonable treatment. But the broader questions about institutional control and royal accountability remained largely unresolved. The Golden Gates of Windsor would reopen to them, but the experience had changed their understanding of what those gates represented. They were no longer symbols of welcome and inclusion, but reminders of the conditional nature of their acceptance within the royal circle. The price of that acceptance, silence in the face of institutional overreach, had been paid, but not without extracting concessions that might benefit other families facing similar situations in the future. 3 weeks later, Margaret Shand walked through the gates of Windsor Castle for the first time since that humiliating morning, when they had been turned away. The guards who processed her simplified security clearance were polite and efficient, the bureaucratic machinery functioning as smoothly as the palace officials had promised. But as she made her way through the familiar corridors toward her daughter's private apartments, Margaret carried with her a new understanding of the institution that had welcomed Camilla into its ranks. The monarchy they had served so faithfully was not the benevolent tradition they had imagined, but a complex political system capable of both great kindness and ruthless self-preservation. The reunion with Camilla was emotional and complicated, filled with apologies and explanations that could not fully bridge the gap created by weeks of forced separation. They had won the right to maintain their family relationships, but the victory had come at a cost that would influence their interactions with the royal establishment for years to come. The Golden Gates were open once again, but they would never look quite the same to any of them. Behind their gleaming surfaces lay a world of power and protocol that demanded constant vigilance from those who dared to challenge its authority, even in the name of something as fundamental as a mother's love for her daughter.